All right. So I have the rarest of occasions here for y'all because I'm about to give Piers Morgan 100%, maybe 90% credit for a recent interview that he just did with this Israeli government spokesman who was having a pretty significant degree of trouble answering some very simple questions. So let's go ahead and jump into this and try to work our way through.
Jerusalem is Israeli government spokesman Avi Hyman. Mr. Hyman, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Why did Israel reject this apparent offer of a peace deal from Hamas that they'd agreed to?
Hi, Piers. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm not sure what Israel has rejected. I know that Hamas put out a statement that they had accepted some kind of a proposal. It's somewhat unclear to us what proposal they accepted. This was obviously, as my Prime Minister said in the last hour, a way of trying to torpedo our entry into Rafah. And as you said, the last 4 battalions of Hamas are in Rafah. Our war aims remain the same: to destroy Hamas, bring home the hostages, and ensure that Gaza doesn't pose a threat to us. As the Prime Minister said, with or without a deal, we're going to need to go into Rafah. So we entered Rafah. We're keeping the pressure up, the military pressure on Hamas. That's what worked last time when we got about half of the hostages released. And that's what we're doing now. We will keep up the pressure and explore all of the diplomatic channels. But at the moment, Hamas's position is far, far away from ours, sadly.
Okay, so Piers is going to move on to another question, and he's actually going to do a really good job pressing him on that follow-up question. But because he didn't respond to anything that he just said in this intro part, I'm going to respond to it. So there's a number of different things that he just said that I think are completely inaccurate. Number one is that the deal that Hamas accepted a few days ago that Israel then rejected, that deal was a deal that was being negotiated between Israel, Qatar, and Egypt, as well as CIA Director Burns, who was there as well. So the deal that they accepted wasn't just like some random outlandish thing that's been completely disconnected from any of the talks that have been going on. No, it was actually very similar to the deal that the United States of America was helping to craft. Okay, so let's just be clear about that aspect of it. The reason that Israel doesn't like that deal is because the implication of it is that it will actually bring about a permanent end to the war, to the genocide. Israel doesn't want to do that, which is further, elaborated on by this guy and Benjamin Netanyahu multiple times coming out and saying, we are going to go into Rafah regardless of whether or not there is a ceasefire deal or a hostage deal put in place, which is the second point that I want to just mention real quick, which is that why would Hamas, just regardless of if you hate Hamas, you love Hamas, I don't like Hamas, but let's just try to put ourselves in their shoes from a negotiating perspective, right? Why would Hamas agree to give up their leverage in the form of the hostages that they still have in their possession in exchange for a temporary pause in the fighting, after which, in a couple of weeks, Israel continues to obliterate Gaza? What kind of a deal would that be? Obviously, a deal needs to involve the end to the genocide. Not, we're going to do a temporary pause, you give us all of the hostages back, and then we'll continue the genocide. That just in and of itself would never be a deal that would work, right? Now, the other thing that I'll say before we continue here is that what he just said in terms of trying to pressure Hamas by going into Rafah, that's going to somehow bring the hostages home, that's going to somehow, get us to the end of this war. Two things on that. Number one, even U.S. military officials have, for months and months at this point, recognize the reality, the fact that you are not going to be able to defeat Hamas militarily. You're not going to be able to completely eradicate Hamas, right? And point number two is that the only time hostages were actually returned in bulk to Israel was during a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire that was put in place back in November. So the amount of hostages you've actually saved through military means is lower than the amount of hostages that you have killed through your military campaign. So, let's just make all of that clear. But anyways, Piers didn't push back on that. He's going to push back on the next question, and we can continue here.
Sadly.
How many civilians in Rafah, of the 1.5 million people there, is Israel prepared to view as collateral damage to eliminate the remaining Hamas terrorists?
Piers, as you know, the IDF does our absolute utmost to avoid civilian casualties. Just in the first day of the operation, we've taken 100,000 citizens, civilians from Rafah out of Rafah.
Well, that leaves 1.4 million.
Okay, and it's a work in progress. So
my question is that you're trying to eliminate Hamas completely, but in the process, already you've pretty much destroyed most of northern Gaza. You've already killed up to 40,000 people, depending on whether you accept the Hamas-run health authority numbers. Obviously, a number of those people are Hamas, and a large number are innocent civilians, women and children. And if you go into someone like Rafah, which has 1.5 million people who've been told to go there by Israel, who've been displaced from their homes, which have been destroyed in the main, and gone to this refugee camp, how many could die before Israel says we can't continue this operation?
Piers, we're fighting against Hamas, a genocidal terror organization. I've seen your coverage, your tremendous coverage of what Hamas did to us on October 7th. You and I know they want to do it again and again and again. That's their words, not mine. Now, we'll do what we have to do to go after Hamas, to avoid civilian casualties, something that we have successfully done. Out of that Hamas number that you just gave, more than 14,000 are terrorists that we took out. There's more than 25,000 Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists.
How many civilians do you believe you've killed?
We don't have exact figures, as you know, it's the fog of war.
Well, you've got exact numbers for Hamas terrorists you've killed. Why wouldn't you know how many civilians you've killed?
Because obviously our focus is to go after the Hamas terrorists. And
that does imply that you're putting a bigger premium on killing Hamas terrorists in terms of numbers and accountability than you are on innocent civilians. That can't be right, surely. If you know exactly how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, you must know how many civilians you've killed. Otherwise, you're prioritizing the lives of terrorists over innocent people.
Piers, with respect, don't put words into my mouth, please. I didn't say exactly 14,000. I said around 14,000. Whereas Hamas will come out with precise numbers that statisticians will look at.
Give me a ballpark number for civilians.
Well, you can use the ballpark as far as the Hamas figures, which I reject as being false.
Well, if they're false, why would you give me those?
I gave you the numbers that I had.
No, you've told me you know how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, but you don't seem to have any idea how many civilians you've killed. I'm just bemused. Why wouldn't you keep count of both?
I don't have that information to give you, Piers. If I did, I would.
You literally no idea how many civilians you've been killing.
I can tell you definitively that our aim is to go after Hamas.
I'm sorry to push you on this. That's quite extraordinary. You're an official spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea how many civilians you've killed. I thought you just told me that you were particularly careful about not killing civilians. But if you don't know how many you've killed, how can you say that with any certainty?
Because even if you were to go by a ratio of the Hamas figures, we would still be far ahead of any.
That wasn't my question. You know it wasn't my question.
I don't have the information.
You literally have no idea how many civilians you've killed.
I mean, it's unreal. It is unreal. Now, I've seen other Israeli officials who have come out and tried to provide some numbers that it seems like they've just completely pulled out of their ass in terms of how many civilians have been killed. Their numbers that the government of Israel usually release, they don't even mathematically make any sense, right? In order for Israel to have killed 14,000, 15,000 is another claim we heard in recent videos. 14,000, 15,000 Hamas fighters killed. That would imply that literally every single man that you have killed in Gaza was a Hamas militant, right? And even then some on top of that. I mean, 2/3, upwards of 70% of the people they've killed so far have been women and children, right? 15,000 or so children have been killed at this point. And those are based on the numbers that we know from the Gaza Ministry of Health, or as he calls it, the Hamas-controlled Gaza Ministry of Health. Those numbers, by the way, have been proven throughout previous, wars and conflicts to be extremely reliable, both by the United States and by the Israeli government. But even just going by those numbers, the math of 14,000 Hamas militants being killed doesn't add up unless you literally believe every adult man who has been killed is a Hamas militant, which is obviously not true, unless you're also believing at the same time that, okay, we've killed 2/3 or 70% women and children, but all of the rest of them were Hamas militants. And even then, again, the numbers still would not add up. So it really is just amazing that he doesn't even have a ballpark estimate. He doesn't even have a ballpark that he can give to Piers. And credit to Piers for not letting up. I mean, he's going to continue to press him on this. But before we get back to that, I want to circle back to the hostage negotiations, right? Because there was a claim that was made, towards the beginning of this conversation that, well, it's Hamas really that's sort of standing in the way of any sort of deal. We don't know what deal they recently accepted. We want to get a deal, but Hamas is just being unreasonable, right? And so there was a good video that I'll link down below in the description here from Breakthrough News, where they detail every single deal that was proposed and accepted by Hamas that was rejected by Israel. So let's just watch a little bit of this. I have it on 1.5 speed so that we can just get a glance at it. We don't need to watch the whole thing, but here are just some of the deals that have been rejected so far.
Here's every ceasefire deal and prisoner exchange that Hamas has offered Israel since October 7th. October 9th, Hamas offers Israel an unspecified number of women and children being held hostage in Gaza in exchange for 36 Palestinian women and children being held hostage in Israeli prisons. October 16th, a Hamas official says they'd free all Israeli captives in Gaza in exchange for 6,000 Palestinian captives in Israel. October 17th, a Hamas official tells NBC News that they'd release all of their Israeli civilian captives if Israel agreed to stop bombing Gaza. October 28th, Hamas's leader in Gaza offers to release all of the Israeli captives in Gaza in exchange for all of the Palestinian captives in Israeli prisons. prisons. This proposal, more commonly known as All for All, was a demand widely adopted by Israelis protesting against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. November 17th, Qatari negotiators proposed a deal where Hamas will release 50 Israeli captives in exchange for a 3-day ceasefire. Hamas agrees to the general outline of the deal. Israel refuses. January 2nd, Hamas proposed a 3-phase deal where Hamas releases 40 Israeli captives in exchange for a gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and the release of Palestinian captives. In the last phase, Israel would end the war and Hamas would release all of its Israeli captives. Israel rejected this offer. January 18th, members of the Israeli government make a proposal to Benjamin Netanyahu to reopen negotiations with Hamas. He refuses. January 22nd, Israel rejects a deal where Hamas would release Israeli captives in exchange for the release of Palestinian captives, a withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, and accepting Hamas's leadership in Gaza. February 7th, Hamas proposes a 3-phased, 4.5-month ceasefire, where in the first phase, Hamas would release all women, children, ill, and young male Israeli captives in exchange for the release of Palestinian women and children being held captive in Israeli jails. In the second phase, adult male captives on both sides would be exchanged, and then in the third phase, remains of the dead and an end to the war. March 15th, Hamas offers to release Israeli women, children, elderly, and sick captives being held in Gaza in exchange for 700 to 1,000 Palestinian captives in Israeli prisons. And most recently, yesterday, Hamas offered to participate in a proposed 3-stage deal where in the first phase, Hamas would release Israeli female prisoners for 50 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons each. After 11 days of ceasefire, Israel would begin to dismantle its military structures in Gaza. In the second phase, there would be a halt to all military activity in Gaza. And then in the final phase, the war and Israel's blockade on Gaza would end, and the reconstruction process would begin. Israel rejected this deal.
So, I mean, there you go. Again, I'm not entertaining the narrative that it's been Hamas that has been the primary blockade to getting a deal, right? There have been so many different deals that have been on the table that Hamas was ready to accept. Even some of those, as you guys notice, didn't even involve a permanent end to the war. Some of those were temporary truces that Hamas was offering, and Israel still rejected even those. So again, not going to be entertaining those kinds of narratives. Now, in terms of Israel going out of their way to avoid hitting civilians and to only go after Hamas, just as a reminder, I've mentioned this story a couple times in my previous videos, but it really is just so egregious that it's worth focusing on, and the link will be down in the description if you want to go watch the video that was put together here by Jeremy Diamond, and he's actually been doing some really good work, working for CNN throughout the last 6 or 7 months. But, I mean, in this story, you have basically Israel used a precision-guided missile, okay, and they struck a group of children, killing 11 of them as they were outside at a foosball table, right? So under this guy's, narrative that he's trying to spin here, we would have to believe that there was a Hamas militant hiding underneath the foosball table, right? In order for that to be some sort of a targeted strike, if you will. Of course, that's not the case. And of course, another part of this story is that Israel then lied about it. They denied that they had any strikes in the area. Then they said, okay, we had a strike in the area, but it was against a Hamas militant. And then when CNN came back to them and they said, hey, here's our definitive evidence that, yes, this was an Israeli military strike, and yes, it did only kill 11 children, no Hamas militants that have been confirmed at all, that were even remotely in the area, then Israel cuts off communications and they decline to comment, right? So that's a pretty standard operating procedure for them, but we can continue with this interview where he's going to, give us more of the dodging of this basic question here from Piers.
Not that I don't know. I'm not authorized to give the information. I don't have the information.
That's complete nonsense. Why are you authorized to give me the number of terrorists you've killed, but not a number of civilians? I don't understand.
I guess he just gave up. He just completely folded inwards in on himself and just gave up mentally.
Right?
Piers, we will go after Hamas. We will ensure that we...
you want me to believe you're being incredibly careful about how many civilians you're killing, and you have an amazing exemplary record, but you don't know how many civilians you're killing. So how do I know you've been careful?
Piers, when the dust settles, we will come out with the proper numbers. Hamas runs to the press daily with false...
When the dust settles, a lot of people will have died, and you know...
Yeah, just trust us. We'll give you guys an update on the amount of people that we've killed after we've completed the genocide. I mean, what a line there. These guys are all wind-up dolls. That's the only way that I can describe these Israeli government spokespeople. It is literally bar for bar, word for word, the exact same lines, and they're extremely lazy. Extremely lazy. They're so easy to disprove, if you've been paying attention over the last 6 or 7 months. How many stories have I brought you guys that are exactly similar to this one? And he just expects us to go along with the narrative of it's all just Hamas using human shields, right?
How many Hamas you've killed, but you don't know how many civilians you've killed. And I'm just asking you why. Why is it you've kept a record of one, but not the other?
I personally don't have that information to give to you. You can ask me over and over. I'm not going to come up with more information. I don't
you don't know?
I don't have that information, Piers.
Well, you're an official government spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea.
Piers, I came on here to focus on what's going on with the war.
Well, actually, you came on here to answer my questions, I think.
Yeah, and I don't have an answer for you for that.
And I didn't intend to press you on this point because I assumed that you would not respond the way you have. But I've never had an Israeli spokesman who simply said, I have no idea. Particularly after you boasted about the fact you've been very smart in the way you've avoided killing civilians. How do you know if you've got no idea how many you've killed?
Because I know the way in which the IDF operates. I know the way in which we go after the terrorists in the best possible way. It's not what I've said, it's what General Petraeus has said, it's what John Spencer from West Point has said, it's what multiple British generals have said. Israel goes out of its way to avoid civilian casualties. That's what we'll do. If you can point to me to another conflict by which they have evacuated, got out of harm's way civilians to the extent that Israel has done, then fine.
With respect, Mr. Hyman, how can you...
That's amazing as well. Those are the people that you're going to cite. You're going to cite U.S. generals and British generals and in praising you for how well you're doing in avoiding civilian casualties. Not exactly the best sources, right? Top-ranking generals who themselves are likely complicit in countless different war crimes over the years. I mean, I showed you guys that video yesterday of retired, former General Mark Milley, who was one of the highest-ranking generals in the U.S. military, and he just straight up came out and said, who are we to criticize how Israel is waging this war? We're the United States of America. We've slaughtered countless innocent civilians. I mean, that's literally what General Mark Milley just said a couple of days ago. So again, not exactly like the best sources for who should determine whether or not Israel is following international law and, taking care to avoid civilians. I think I would much rather go to sources like highly respected and credible international humanitarian aid organizations or UN reports that are backed up with evidence. But no, he just wants the testimony of war criminals, I guess. But they continue.
Possibly expect me to accept any comparisons to any other conflict or war, given that you do not know how many civilians you've killed.
Piers, you understand that I can't prosecute the war over the media.
I'm just asking you for basic information. I'm not trying to trap you, and I'm not trying to unfairly harangue you. I think people are watching this and they'll make their own conclusions. I just find it astonishing that the moment I asked you how many Hamas you killed, you could tell me immediately, and the moment I ask you about civilians, you haven't got a clue, literally. You're not even prepared to issue a ballpark number. And I think people will find that staggering, particularly given that you are insistent that you're doing everything you can to avoid killing civilians. To which, again, I just simply ask, how do you know? If you don't know how many you're killing, how can you possibly be sure that you are, A, doing better than other people waging war elsewhere, or B, that you have any idea how many you're killing? You don't, clearly.
The IDF monitors every single action that it takes. It weighs out the options.
It doesn't tell you, the official spokesman.
It avoids civilian casualties in the best possible way.
How do you know, Mr. Hyman?
Even if you were to take, please...
With respect, you come on here as the official Israeli government spokesman, and you don't want to be asked how many you've killed because you don't know, and yet you want us to draw comparisons to other conflicts in a positive way for Israel, and you want to tell me that IDF make a record of every single thing they're involved in, but they don't give it to you, the government spokesman, so that when I ask you, you have no idea. Do you understand how ridiculous that sounds? With respect.
With all due respect, I've told you that even if you were to use the Hamas figures, the ratio would still be...
I mean, with respect... Right? I love that ending there from Piers. So, I mean, listen, they kind of go on for another minute. We don't really need to play any more of it. It's kind of the same thing. But Piers is 100% correct, guys. Okay? He is 100% correct in this clip. How can you possibly make the argument that this is a historic effort by Israel? We're doing more than any other country in the world would in terms of trying to protect civilians. But you don't know how many civilians you've killed. Then how the fuck are you making that determination in the first place? I mean, it's outrageous. The level of gaslighting that Israeli politicians and Israeli spokespeople believe that they can get away with is just wild, right? And again, this is Piers Morgan. Okay, this isn't Mehdi Hassan. This isn't, some well-respected independent journalist who's going to do a good job pressing these people. This is Piers Morgan, the guy who has spent the last 6-7 months waffling about whether or not Israel is good or bad or doing good things or bad things and who could really say what a genocide is or what a war crime is or whatever the case may be. It's Piers fucking Morgan. And even with slight pushback, just a follow-up question, demanding an answer to a very basic question, this guy just completely folds. The only environment in which Israeli spokespeople can come out looking good is an environment in which it's just total, lock in step with whatever they want, right? If there is no pushback whatsoever, and you just accept everything the IDF says at face value, then okay, you're going to come out of that looking spotless. But if it's even just mild pushback, like what we just saw from Piers Morgan, they just fold. I mean, he literally went dead silent at one point in this conversation. Now, in terms of the actual statistics of how many civilians have been killed, these are some of the numbers that I typically go to here, the latest from Euromed Human Rights Monitor. And the reason that I typically use these numbers instead of the Gaza Ministry of Health is that Euromed is attempting to include in their count, I believe, the amount of people who have been trapped under the rubble and are presumed dead. But keep in mind, even this number is likely an undercount. It is extremely, extremely difficult to get an accurate update on any sort of regular basis on how many people have been killed when Israel has completely leveled, their hospital system, their education system, the entirety of Gaza, essentially killed so many different aid workers and civil workers within Gaza that it's near impossible to get accurate updates, right? Which means the number has been sort of stalling out for a few months now. I believe the Gaza Ministry of Health, their latest estimate is still at around like 35,000 or so, and that number really hasn't been updated in months at this point, really. But here from Euromed Human Rights Monitor, their latest numbers from October 7th to the 23rd of April. So this is, even this is a few weeks out of date. But 42,510 total have been killed. 15,780 of them have been children, 10,091 of them have been women, and 38,621 of them have been civilians. So, I mean, basically Euromed is arguing that, according to their numbers, around like 4,000 or so that have been killed in Gaza have been Hamas militants, and 38,600 have been civilians. So, I mean, keep these numbers in mind when Israeli officials come out and say, this is the best ratio of civilians to combatants killed in any war ever. I mean, it's just a complete lie. And I mean, we also have these other statistics, right? Basically, the entire population has been displaced, hundreds of thousands of homes that have been completely destroyed or partially destroyed. Over 130 journalists at this point have been killed. 80,000 almost have been injured. 178 destroyed or damaged press headquarters, 445 damaged schools, 2,200 destroyed industrial facilities, 905 healthcare professionals who have been killed, 322 healthcare facilities have been destroyed, 651 mosques. Just how do we even put that in perspective? 651 mosques, 203 heritage sites, 203 civil defense workers, and then thousands and thousands have been detained or disappeared. Now, I'll just remind you guys of some other statistics that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks here. This is a report from France 24, just detailing some real numbers to get a perspective on how much destruction there has been inside of Gaza. And keeping in mind that Gaza is 5 miles by about 25 or so miles in terms of the length and the width of it. It is one of the most densely populated places on the face of the planet. This is what Israel has done. According to satellite analysis by Cher and Jamin van den Hoek, a associate professor of geography at Oregon State University, 57% of Gaza buildings were damaged or destroyed as of April 21. Okay? 57% of buildings, of all buildings, have been destroyed. A majority of the structures in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed at this point. 60% of healthcare facilities were indicated as damaged or destroyed. Now, 60% of healthcare facilities damaged or destroyed, this was all the way back in the first 6 weeks of the war. In the first 6 weeks of this war, Israel destroyed a majority of the healthcare facilities. There's more. The World Health Organization, the WHO, said that the second operation at Al-Shifa Hospital reduced the hospital to an empty shell strewn with human remains. And then later, obviously, there were mass graves that were found outside with hundreds of bodies. We also have this. As of April 25th, UNICEF counted 408 schools damaged, representing at least 72.5% of its count. 72.5% of schools have been damaged or destroyed. And just to compare that here, I mean, this is saying 445 damaged schools. This one is saying 408. So roughly similar numbers here. I'm sure they're using different, methods of analysis, but pretty similar numbers. I mean, 72% of the schools damaged or destroyed. And then finally, 61% of mosques have been damaged or destroyed. And it's more bombed out than the bombing of Dresden, the Allied bombing of Dresden during World War II, which was widely known as one of the most intense bombing campaigns in terms of civilian infrastructure in history. We've already surpassed that point inside of Gaza. And you can also do comparisons. I brought these numbers up before as well. You know, the 2017 U.S. coalition to expel the Islamic State from the Iraqi city of Mosul. And this was, at the time, considered one of the most intense attacks on a city in generations. And in 9 months, they killed around 10,000 civilians, with a third of them being from the coalition's bombardment. So really like 3,000 civilians were killed in this 9-month battle with ISIS in Mosul, okay? And we're doing a comparison now in Gaza where over 15,000 children have been killed. Not civilians, 15,000 children have been killed in 7 months. I mean, Jesus Christ. Also, again, 2014 to 2017, the campaign to defeat ISIS in Iraq. The coalition carried out 15,000 strikes across the country. So 15,000 strikes in Iraq in the battle against ISIS from 2014 to 2017. 15,000 strikes. By comparison, the Israeli military said last week it had conducted 22,000 strikes in Gaza. Now, this article is all the way back from January, right? But just to give you that perspective, right? Israel dropped significantly more bombs on Gaza in just last week, 1 week, okay? More bombs in Gaza in 1 week than the U.S. coalition did over a 3-year period in the entire country of Iraq while fighting ISIS. So, you know, when we hear Israeli government spokespeople come out and say things like, oh, well, it's unprecedented, the amount of care that Israel takes, you know, to protect Gaza civilians. No, it's actually the exact opposite of that. This is one of, if not the single most intense bombing campaigns against a civilian population in recorded history, okay? You have killed more children in this period of time than any other conflict in history. In fact, we saw those other, I believe it was a UN report that came out that said really the speed and scale of death and destruction in Gaza, you'd have to go back to the Rwandan genocide to get an actual comparison in terms of how many civilians are being killed in this quickly of a manner. So it is unprecedented. All of this is unprecedented in a way that looks absolutely horrific for Israel, in a way that, you know, leads to people like me and UN experts and human rights organizations coming to the conclusion that this is a genocide. And so, I mean, listen, again, you might never hear me say this again, but credit to Piers Morgan. Credit to Piers Morgan. Just asking basic follow-up questions, poking some holes, trying to get them to actually, you know, stick to an answer and not just regurgitate standard IDF talking points. And, you know, I don't know what it is. I mean, maybe it's that whenever Piers has an IDF representative or a pro-Israel person and it's just a one-on-one, then maybe he's significantly more critical. But then when he has somebody who's defending Palestinians, his attitude completely changes, and then he's much more so trying to press the pro-Palestine people. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just the way that he woke up the day that he did this interview. But there you go. Okay, credit to Piers Morgan. This IDF spokesperson, you know, fully leveled to the ground, just like the IDF has done to Gaza.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying